areas of psychology to develop was an area called psychophysics. Here is the setting. It is the 19th century, and there was a great deal of optimism and a great deal of hope in science. And astronomers in Greenwich Observatory were studying the movement of the stars. And they had good equipment, they have good telescopes. But the problem is that different researchers would give different results. Some would say, oh yeah, that star's moved, and others would say, no, it hasn't. And that's strange because they had good apparatus. The problem was not a problem with the machinery, but the problem with the researchers. It was a psychological issue, because it turns out that people aren't very good at observing small changes over time. You probably noticed when someone had a haircut, but you probably didn't notice the very slow and gradual change the months before while the person's hair was growing. And this meant that the limits of scientific knowledge are bounded within the limits of human perception. This helped to give the impetus to develop psychophysics. What psychophysics was trying to do is it was trying to figure out the laws, sometimes mathematical laws, of the limits of human perception. One of the leading psychophysicists was the psychologist Ernst Weber. Here is an example of the classic psychophysics experiment, the kind of which he was designing in the 1860s. You are the psychophysicist, and you ask me, oh, do you see that light? Yes. Move away. Do you see the light? Yes. Move away. Do you see the light? Kind of. Move away. Do you see the light? No. So what you've just done is you've worked out that I can see the light from such and such a distance away. And so what the psychophysicists were doing is they were figuring out the limits of human perception. And that also included the study of consciousness, because they were studying when people became conscious of stimuli. Now, this study of perception and consciousness, and also study of other psychological states such as emotions and memory, this was legitimized by Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, in so many words, Darwin's theory said that if a living thing has a trait, it has that trait because it's beneficial to have that trait. It's evolved to have that trait. In the same way that the giraffe has evolved to have a long neck, so human beings have evolved to have our memory and consciousness. And so it is legitimate, it is scientifically legitimate to study these things. The problem with psychophysics is that it was based on introspection. So you ask me, do you see the thing? And I say, yep. Or I say, nope. But you can't verify that with anyone else. You can't check. No one else can check if I can see the thing, because it's me seeing it. As well as that, let's imagine that you're doing an experiment with, I don't know, testing feelings of pain. And you ask two people, do you feel pain? And one person says, yep, I feel pain 5 out of 10. Another person says, well, I feel it 7 out of 10. Well, it's not clear what that means, because maybe what one person says as 5 is the same feeling as what the other person says as 7. And so this is a creeping problem with psychology not being seen as scientific enough. The best example is our next figure, the work of Sigmund Freud around 1900. Now, Sigmund Freud was a medical doctor, and what he was doing is he was treating people with what at the time was called hysteria, which we today refer to as anxiety disorders. So what Freud was doing is he was treating people with what we now call anxiety disorders, and he developed psychological therapy, talking therapy, which, and let's give credit to Freud and his movement in psychology, which was called the psychoanalysts. They developed psychological therapy, which is a strange idea. You get someone who's very upset, anxious or depressed, you get someone who's very upset, and I'll talk to the person about what upsets them for hours and hours, and somehow they get better. Well, that's a remarkable discovery, and so we should thank Freud for that. But the problem with Freud is he was terribly unscientific. First of all, he would talk about small numbers of case studies of patients, so it's not obvious that what he said about that small number of people was true of everyone, but also his theories could not be tested scientifically. So Freud's idea was that people were driven by unconscious motivations. People are driven by motivations that they aren't even aware of. And for Freud, it was primarily motivations towards sex and motivations toward aggression. And his idea was that anxiety occurred when people tried to hold down, repress, push down these socially unacceptable drives into the unconscious mind. So the idea is you have the id, which is your drives, some of which are antisocial. You've got the superego, which is basically everything society wants you to be, and who you are is kind of a fight between the two of them, and you push down the id, the unacceptable drives into the unconscious. But the problem is that can't be scientifically tested, because the whole idea of the unconscious is it's unobserved and it can't be measured. Other scientists, such as physicists, have a tendency not to see psychology as scientific, and much of that is to do with the work of Freud and the psychoanalysts. Now, the problem that we had with psychology is it wasn't very scientific. Okay, so how do we know things in a scientific way? This takes us to the last philosopher I'm going to talk about, the philosopher Karl Popper. Now, remember, with David Hume, we had that problem of induction. Experiment can never prove things true. Well, Karl Popper was a philosopher. He takes David Hume's idea and he picks it up and he turns it upside down. What Popper said was, yes, experience can never prove something true, but it can prove something false. If I begin with my claim, all rabbits are brown, I can prove that wrong with the experience of seeing a black rabbit, or a white rabbit, or a rabbit of any other color. And so experience can prove things wrong. This was Popper's idea of falsifiability. Something is scientific if it's set up in such a way that if you were wrong, you know about it. And that the purpose of science is to prove ideas wrong. And this is what we often use in psychological studies, the part of psychology that uses statistics. In psychological studies, we often use what's called null hypothesis significance testing, in which we take an idea of the world and we use statistics to see if we can prove that idea wrong, which is somewhat similar to Popper's idea, although it has some statistics and some probability included as well. Now, psychologists themselves were aware of this problem, the problem of introspection and all of these unscientific Freudian ideas. And this led to another movement in psychology called behaviorism. And the figure that we'll look at now is John B. Watson. John B. Watson was called a behaviorist. And what the behaviorists were trying to do is they were a group of psychologists in the early 20th century, primarily in the United States of America. They were trying to make psychology a serious, rigorous scientific subject. And they were going to do that by being very strict on what they could study and what they could talk about. So there's three parts of behaviorism. First of all, methodological behaviorism. So that means we're going to measure behavior. I'm not going to ask you how you feel. I'm not going to ask you what you think. I'm going to observe how people and also animals respond to different stimuli in terms of their behavior. Because if the rat runs away, everyone can see that the rat has run away. That's externally verifiable. Good. Another part of behaviorism was psychological behaviorism, which means we're not going to talk about feelings. We're not going to even mention mental states or consciousness or perception because we can't study them. We can't find out about them scientifically, and therefore it's outside of our remit. We can't talk about it. They are off limits. The third part of behaviorism was what's called philosophical, otherwise known as logical behaviorism, which, by the way, was also included in the dualism-monism diagram before. Philosophical behaviorism, which John B. Watson adhered to, that he believed in, philosophical behaviorism was the idea that mental states don't even exist. So it's not just that we can't study them, it's that they don't exist. So for Watson, it doesn't make sense to say that someone cried because they were sad, because to Watson, to cry is to be sad. There's nothing behind the tears. It's just the behavior itself of crying. If someone runs away, well, that's what fear is. Fear is just running away. There's none of this subjective nonsense under the surface. Radical behaviorism was when you believed all three of those behaviorist positions, because the whole behaviorist idea was the stimuli comes in and then the response comes out. The stimuli comes in, the sensory input comes in, and then we get the behavioral response. People are a blank slate and are determined by their environment. This leads us to the debate about whether people are naturally good or evil, which is obviously a very philosophical debate. People have been thinking about this for a long time. For example, the philosopher Hobbes believed that people were naturally evil and selfish, whereas the philosopher Rousseau believed that people were good but were made antisocial by society. Well, the Freudian position, which is somewhat more pessimistic, the Freudian position is that people are naturally bad and antisocial and are driven by antisocial desires such as towards sex and aggression. This is somewhat similar to the idea of original sin. Well, the behaviorist idea is different to that. The behaviorist idea is that people are blank slates that are affected by their environments, that whether people are good or bad is entirely determined by their environment. Again, the behaviorists were determinists. Everything is affected by your environment. And behaviorism led to some remarkable scientific discoveries, such as classical conditioning and operant conditioning, different ways that people learn through association. And in fact, today, anxiety disorders, particularly avoidance within anxiety, and also addiction are thought of in terms of behaviorist terms, in terms of learning from association between stimuli. Another thing that behaviorism did, which was very good, was the development of exposure therapy, which is still among the leading therapies for phobias and anxiety. We're up to the 1950s, and now people are starting to lose faith in behaviorism because there are some things that behaviorism can't explain. So if everything is explained by stimulus and response, if all fears are learned from the environment, it doesn't explain why people are very easy to develop a fear of snakes, but it's unbelievably difficult to give someone a fear of flowers. It doesn't explain, for example, why personality traits are heritable and run in families. And so the behaviorists were wrong in saying that everything was a blank slate. It turns out that people are partly affected by their environment and partly by their genetics. And behaviorism as well couldn't explain how people develop language. The behaviorist B.F. Skinner wrote a book published in 1957 called Verbal Behavior, in which he said, he said, language can be explained through reward and punishment. When the child says a word, he gets a lot of attention, he keeps saying more words. But the problem is, if that was true, people wouldn't develop language with the rapidity that people actually do. People learn language so quickly, it can't possibly be explained by stimulus and response. Another problem that the behaviorists had, and this is the problem that Hume had as well, you can't explain how all this information is coming in. So it comes in to the mind, well, it comes in as sensory input, doesn't make any sense. Your mind needs to find some way to make sense of it. Well, the behaviorists couldn't explain that. The information just kind of goes in. And this led to what is called the cognitive revolution, which is basically the development of the new approach, which is the modern current approach in psychology, which is cognitivism, which is basically the idea that information comes in, stimulus, and then it's processed in the mind, and then you have the response. This is a bit like what Kant was saying, where the mind has to calculate and process the information. Now, one reason why this cognitive theory of the mind developed was because of the developments of the computer. One person who developed the computer was Alan Turing. Alan Turing, when he was working on the computer, he would work in Coupland Building 3 on Coupland Street in the University of Manchester. I mention that because I myself have the honor of teaching in that exact same building. Once people have developed the computer, now we have a metaphor to explain the mind as a computer. Sensory input, then the information is processed, and then we have output. And one leading figure in this cognitive revolution, the development of cognitive psychology, was George Miller, who studied the limits of working memory. And so now we can actually scientifically study memory. You can have lab experiments in which you show people images, very brief flashes. Do you remember seeing it? Press yes or press no. And so psychologists have developed robust, highly controlled experiments to study mental processes such as memory and attention. Since the cognitive revolution, the more recent innovations in psychology have been to do with neuroscience, the development of the MRI in Nottingham University in the 1970s, the development of the functional MRI, which can basically take videos of brain activity, in the 1990s. And the argument could be made that as time goes on, psychology will be more and more subsumed by neuroscience and the study of the brain. Okay, so what have we learned from this? Well, psychology is still a new science, and it's still a science that's trying to figure out some of the conceptual underpinnings, whether or not the brain is the same as the mind, whether or not you can actually study things that are subjective, and how strictly we should adhere to the scientific methods. Within psychology, if you learn research methods in psychology, two of the camps are the quantitative, which is the statistical, for example, experimental or observational studies on one end, and also the qualitative side, which uses focus groups and interviews, which give more information about the people that we're studying. It's not reducing them to numbers, but then you can't generalize to a wider population. And so psychology is a new science that is still ongoing and still developing.